This week's episode of Naked Mormonism is brought to you by HelloFresh. Go to HelloFresh.com and enter promo code NAKED30 to get $30 off your first week of food delivery service.
I'm Cara Santa Maria, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 94 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, March 15th, the Ides of March, 2018. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, we dive into our historical timeline by examining the power of the press in early Mormonism. From the Book of Mormon to the Times and Seasons, the Mormons were publication fiends in absolute control of the information going out of Nauvoo through public literature. Ebenezer Robinson, Thomas B. Marsh, and Don Carlos Smith work as editors for the Times and Seasons, which goes off without a hitch until August of 1841. Polygamy starts to be taught to various members of trusted Mormon elite without common consent of the average chapel-attending Mormon. After that, we have on Lydia Finch to discuss cults, how to identify them, and what mechanisms they use to exert control over their members. Stick around after the interview to hear the details about the upcoming Protect LDS Children March at the end of this month. Let's get into it. Beginning with its inception, Joseph's Mormonite sect had some kind of propaganda machine turning out publications on behalf of the church at stunning volume. It all began in 1830 with the seminal Mormon publication, the Book of Mormon. What followed it was a string of newspaper publications and editions of Mormon revelations known as the Book of Commandments, which came to be known as the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835. The first periodical newspaper the early church published was under the name of the Evening and the Morning Star. The newspaper debuted in 1832 from the Independence, Missouri printing press, with editor-in-chief William Wines, Double Dub Phelps, overseeing every word printed. From the Independence, Missouri printing press, we had the Book of Commandments. When it was printed, it included passages like this from the modern-day Doctrine and Covenants section 42, quote, "For it shall come to pass, that which I spake by the mouths of my prophets shall be fulfilled, for I will consecrate the riches of the Gentiles unto my people which are of the house of Israel." End quote. This command by Joseph speaking for God basically said that the property of the Gentiles will be appropriated to the Mormons. This revelation making its way around Missouri while the Mormons were settling and building their kingdom and independence, their designated Zion, caused enough public outcry that it resulted in the Mormons' expulsion from Jackson County and the burning of that printing press. The Evening and the Morning Star ceased publication at that time for want of a printing press which wasn't literally on fire. As the Mormons in Missouri were resettling in the counties north of Jackson County, the Mormon HQ in Kirtland, Ohio began printing the Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate, a monthly publication which ran until suffering financial problems with the fallout of the Kirtland Safety Society Banking Company and the Panic of 1837. Many of the revelations, including from modern-day sections 64 through 110, were all published in the Messenger and Advocate, along with other church-related topics and even some of Eliza Snow's poems. When the Messenger and Advocate collapsed under Oliver Cowdery's watch, Don Carlos Smith, youngest brother of the prophet, started up the Elders Journal in Kirtland. This monthly journal ran 2 publications prior to the Mormon exodus from Ohio to Missouri, where it published 2 more issues from far west Missouri prior to the Mormons' exodus from Missouri to Illinois. During the ensuing chaos of the fallout from the Missouri Mormon War, The press, the actual printing press machine and the typeset were legitimately buried underground in Far West to keep it from falling into Gentile hands. So once the Mormons had begun their settlement in Commerce, Illinois, and they were reasonably certain that they could put down semi-permanent roots in that state, two men named Elias Smith and Hiram Clark went back to Far West in Missouri, and they unearthed the printing press and the typeset in April of 1839, when they transported the unit to what would soon become Nauvoo. Ebenezer Robinson, an ambitious young man of 25 years old, was given control of the printing press as primary editor, with Don Carlos Smith being appointed by the prophet as the assistant editor. Ebenezer Robinson and Don Carlos Smith began their work of establishing the press in the cellar of a small shack right on the banks of the Mississippi throughout June to August of 1839, where the working conditions were utterly terrible. Seepage from the walls due to the high water table during the sweltering humid conditions of the Illinois summer cultivated spores of mold and mildew on nearly every surface. Even getting the printed paper to dry with the lack of airflow presented its own challenges. Concluding the conditions were too unfavorable to continue the work of printing, Don Carlos Smith and Ebenezer Robinson petitioned to have a printing establishment built on the northeast corner of Water and Bain Streets in Nauvoo, which was granted by the High Council. A haphazardly constructed makeshift frame building was constructed in late August and early September of 1839, to which the printing press and accompanying equipment were finally moved. And then, finally, in November of 1839, the first publication of the first volume of the Times and Seasons was churned out of the press and widely circulated to the settling saints in Illinois and Iowa. Letters from the prophet updating the saints on his meeting with the President Martin Van Buren and other chapters of the U.S. government were some of the very first articles that were published in the Times and Seasons in December, January, and February of 1839 and 1840. The Times and Seasons continued to be published once or twice per month throughout 1840 and 41 under the direction of Ebenezer Robinson and Don Carlos Smith. Across the pond in Europe, the Latter-day Saints' Millennial Star was established in 1840 while the Quorum of the 12 were on their mission trip, which would continue to be published until 1970. 130 years that the Millennial Star was published in Europe. Throughout the rest of the 1840s, these are the names of other LDS publications which would be published for varying time spans. We have the Gospel Reflector, the Wasp, Nauvoo Neighbor, Gospel Light, the Prophet, New York Messenger, and the People's Organ. The Mormons' bandwidth for turning out propaganda was steadily increasing to match the plethora of Gentile publications who wrote stories about the Mormons in less than favorable light. The Times and Seasons was the most powerful propaganda and history outlet for the church. It was also the most widely consumed publication of the church by those unfamiliar or unfriendly to the Mormons. The Gentiles outside Nauvoo would come to know Joseph Smith and the Mormons through what Ebenezer Robinson and Don Carlos Smith published. The original Systemic History of the Church would be published in 1842 through the Times and Seasons. I mean, there's just simply no way to possibly overstate the power of this single publishing arm of the church. One person Ebenezer Robinson and Don Carlos Smith worked closely with was Robert B. Thompson, who was Joe's personal secretary and recorder/historian. Robert B. Thompson, as an associate newspaper editor, was working with Joe on the comprehensive history of the church to be published in the Times and Seasons by Ebenezer Robinson and Don Carlos Smith. More than just Joe's personal secretary and recorder, Robert B. Thompson was also a very close friend of the prophet, even meriting his own verse in the most important revelation in Nauvoo, which is included as D&C 124 today, where it says this, quote, beginning with verse 12, "And again, verily I say unto you, let my servant Robert B. Thompson help you to write this proclamation, for I am well pleased with him, and that he should be with you. Let him therefore hearken to your counsel, and I will bless him with a multiplicity of blessings. Let him be faithful and true in all things from henceforth, and he shall be great in mine eyes. But let him remember that his stewardship will I require at his hands." End quote. So these three men were closely held acolytes among the printing business in Nauvoo: Ebenezer Robinson, Don Carlos Smith, Robert B. Thompson. Not only did they know what was going on behind the scenes, They filtered that reality through their printing press to determine how the outside world and the average Mormon populace would view the religion and Nauvoo with the times and seasons. 1841 was busy as ever for Joe and the elite of the church. Joe had just taken Louisa Beeman as his first sealed polygamist wife in Nauvoo, and he was actively courting the pregnant newlywed Zina Diantha Huntington Jacobs. Rumors of polygamy had plagued the church from its earliest days. In fact, the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants included this passage as Section 101, verse 4, which was actually taken out of the 1876 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. Quote, "Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife, and that one woman but one husband, except in the case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again." End quote. And, of course, to reiterate, that monogamy revelation, as it could be called, was removed in 1876 with the 1876 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. Rumors of polygamy wouldn't die because polygamy was being actively practiced behind closed doors by the prophet for nearly a decade by the time 1841 hit. The reception of this doctrine of polygamy among Joe's trusted elites was definitely mixed. In an 1845 letter that Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon wrote, he offers a window into his appalled perspective of how the veneer of priesthood was being used to cajole women into consenting to polygamous marriages. Speaking of Nancy Miranda Hyde's marital affiliation with Dr. Willard Richards and with the prophet, whilst Orson Hyde was on a mission, Rigdon said this, and this is taken from page 294 of Van Wagner's Sidney Rigdon, A Portrait of Religious Excess. Quote, "If Richards should take a notion to Hyde's wife," that's Nancy Miranda Johnson, "in his absence," during his mission, of course, "all that is necessary to be done is to be sealed. No harm done, no adultery committed, only taking a little advantage of rights of priesthood. And after Richards has gone the round of dissipation," that's a nice way of putting having sex with her, "with Hyde's wife, she is afterwards turned over to Smith, and thus the poor silly woman becomes the actual dupe of two designing men, under the sanctimonious garb of rights of the royal priesthood." End quote. Now, you can't ignore Rigdon's powerful use of words here. I just absolutely love this guy. But it's also understandable his perspective here, because Hinchman Rigdon had been burned by Joe and the church when he had wrote this in 1845, especially considering that this was written after the majority of the church had either sided with Bloody Brigham or James Strang. So Rigdon had been dealing with the fallout from Joe's free love perspective for a decade and a half when this was written, and he had successfully burned most bridges through his absentee nature through most of Nauvoo history. And to put more perspective on this, Rigdon's own daughter, Nancy Rigdon, had even been propositioned by Joe to be sealed, an action which catalyzed much of the conflict between these two old friends and business partners of Joe and Hinchpin Rigdon. So, Rigdon wasn't exactly favorable towards the doctrine of polygamy. But Brigham Young, of course, he had a little different perspective. Brigham Young said when he first learned of the doctrine of polygamy, quote, "It was the first time in my life that I desired the grave," end quote. Now this quote has widely been interpreted to mean that he was so depressed at learning of the doctrine that, he wanted to die. But I tend to take a different perspective. I think that we can judge from his actions of taking 55 wives during his years that maybe he was just looking forward to the eternal polygamy fest that is the Mormon afterlife, and he desired the grave as soon as humanly possible to get to that eternal sex fest, right? I mean, if Bloody Brigham was a guy who liked having sex with dozens of women, an afterlife comprised of nothing but that would understandably cause him to desire the grave. So I tend to interpret that quote a little bit differently than the broad consensus of Mormon historians. But really, if we take a step back, polygamy was an extremely polarizing issue. Logistically speaking alone, polygamy is a doctrine which can't be widely practiced with a 50-50 male-to-female population split, unless there's widespread polyandry going on to accompany the polygyny. We also can't ignore the need to keep this secret. Adultery laws may seem like a vestige of an older generation, but there are still states today with adultery laws on the books. In the 19th century, it was almost an exclusive majority of states with adultery laws on the books or even in their state constitutions. The ongoing rumors of polygamy pose not only a moral issue for the prophet of the church, but also a legal challenge. Even Hyrum Smith had to be convinced polygamy was commanded of gods once the deafening roar of the rumors became too much to be mere anti-Mormon speculation. Now, Brigham Young actually recalled a conversation he had with Hyrum's sidekick Abiff Smith in 1842 or 43, it's kind of unclear, while Hyrum was supposedly ignorant of the practice. Now, I'm reading this from Dialogue on Mormon Thought, titled Identifying the Earliest Mormon Polygamists, written by Gary James Bergera. I probably slaughtered that name. I'm really sorry, Gary. And this is a really fascinating read. You can find this in the show notes if you'd like to read it, but I'm going to read a quick passage out of it. Quote, right north of the Masonic Hall in Nauvoo, the ground was not fenced. This was in the year 1842, and the historian added, sic 1843. There were some rails laid along the fence up some lots. Now we enter into the conversation that Brigham Young had with Hyrum Smith. Hyrum Smith saw me and said, Brother Brigham, I want to talk to you. We went together and sat upon those rails that were piled up. He commenced by saying, I have a question to ask you. In the first place, I say unto you that I do know that you and the 12 know some things that I don't know. I can understand this by the motions and talk and doings of Joseph, and I know there is something or other which I do not understand that is revealed to the 12. Is this so? I replied, I do not know anything about what you know, but I know what I know. Great dodge by Brigham Young. Then Hyrum said, I have mistrusted for a long time that Joseph has received a revelation that a man should have more than one wife, and he has hinted as much to me, but I would not bear it. Now, Brigham says, I will now go back to where I met Hyrum. He said to me, Hyrum, I am convinced that there is something that has not been told me. I said to him, Brother Hyrum, Joseph would tell you everything the Lord reveals to him if he could. I must confess I feel a little sarcastic towards Hyrum, although he was just as honest as an angel and as full of integrity as the gods, but he had not that ability which Joseph possessed to see and understand men as they were. I took advantage of this, and I said to him, Brother Hyrum, I will tell you about this thing which you say you do not know about, if you will swear with an uplifted hand before God that you will never say another word against Joseph and his doings and the doctrine he is preaching to the people. Hyrum replied, I will do it with all my heart. I want to be saved. And he stood upon his feet saying, I want to be knowing the truth and to be saved. And he made a covenant there never again to bring forward one argument or use any influence against Joseph's doings. Joseph had a good many wives sealed to him. I told Hyrum the whole story, and he bowed to it and wept like a child, and said, God be praised! He went to Joseph and told him what he had learned, and renewed his covenant with Joseph, and they went heart and hand together while they lived, and they were together when they died, and they are together now defending Israel. End quote. There's a lot to tease out of that entire back and forth between Brigham Young. To begin with, the story was reported by Brigham Young only. And it was recounted in 1866. That's 22 years after the fact, while Brigham Young was openly practicing polygamy in his Utah theocracy. There's a whole mixed bag of vested interests and possible false memories in this story, and I mean, honestly, it could be completely apocryphal. But it does illustrate an important point. Polygamy wasn't something decreed over the pulpit in Nauvoo the way it was in Utah in 1852. Polygamy was an aspect of Nauvoo history only existing within the confines of the underbelly of Mormon society, and only practiced by those who could unequivocally be trusted with such damning information. Any malicious actor who came to learn of the practice of polygamy held a toolbox of legal and religious blackmail leverage over the prophet and the Mormon elites. They had to be extremely careful to vet those entrusted with the sacred knowledge to ensure they had the prophet's best interests in mind. Don Carlos Smith wasn't as receptive to the doctrine of polygamy and the rumors surrounding it. You know, we talked about how Hinchpin Rigdon received it, how Bloody Brigham desired the grave, how Hyrum Smith was depressed because he thought that Joseph was keeping a secret from him, but then when Brigham Young told Hyrum Smith about it, he was overjoyed. He said, God's be praised, and then he went and renewed his covenant with Joseph. But Don Carlos Smith is a little bit different of a case. Don Carlos was loved and respected by everybody. He was the sweetheart of the Smith brothers. You know, I've yet to find a single writing concerning Don Carlos that shows him in anything but a favorable light. To be fair, though, in August of 1841, he was a mere 25 years old, so he was only just beginning his career in Mormonism. His fellow editor of the Times and Seasons, Ebenezer Robinson, who spoke with Don Carlos every single day at the office, told his recollections of Don Carlos learning the doctrine of polygamy. This statement was made in 1890, while Ebenezer Robinson was serving as editor of the Whitmerite publication, known as The Return, and the Whitmerites were notoriously opposed to polygamy in the face of their Josephite and Brighamite counterparts. So, Ebenezer Robinson, one of Don Carlos Smith's best friends, recounted in 1890, almost 50 years after the occurrence, what he remembered of Don Carlos saying of the doctrine of polygamy. And I'm actually reading this from Agnes Moulton Coolbrith's biography page on josephsmithpolygamy.org. You'll find a link for it in the show notes. It says, quote, "Any man who will teach and practice the doctrine of spiritual wifery will go to hell. I don't care if it is my brother Joseph." Robinson added, he was a bitter opposer to the spiritual wife doctrine, end quote. So that's Don Carlos, recounted through Ebenezer Robinson almost 50 years after the fact. But I mean, it still gets to a pretty fundamental point. According to Don Carlos's coworker and best friend, Ebenezer Robinson, this vitriolic opposition against polygamy happened in the summer of 1841 when the rumors of polygamy were swirling. And a quick addition to this, Don Carlos Smith's wife, Agnes Moulton Coolbrith, was known as one of the more attractive young women in Nauvoo. She was attentive and charming, and she seemed to have others' interest in mind in spite of any difficulties she may have been suffering, and her warmness always shone through. As a wife of Don Carlos, Agnes wrote to her brothers-in-law during their stay in Liberty Jail in 1839. I'm reading this from page 151 of Todd Compton's book, In Sacred Loneliness. This is the letter from Don Carlos's wife, Agnes Coolbrith, to Hiram and Joseph Smith. Quote, "Beloved brothers, Hiram and Joseph, by the permit of my companion, Don Carlos, I write a line to show that I have not forgotten you, neither do I forget you. For my prayer is to my heavenly Father for your deliverance. It seems as though the Lord is slow to hear the prayers of the saints, but the Lord's ways are not like our ways. Therefore he can do better than we ourselves. You must be comforted, brothers Hiram and Joseph. We look forward for better days. Your little ones are as playful as little lambs. Be comforted concerning them, for they are not cast down and sorrowful as we are. Their sorrows are only momentary, but ours continual. May the Lord bless, protect, and deliver you from all your enemies and restore you to the bosom of your families, is the prayer of signed Agnes M. Smith." End quote. Agnes Coolbrith was truly an amazing woman. She ended up raising one of the most prominent poets of early 20th century California, Ina Coolbrith. And that letter that she wrote to Hiram and Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail is one of the very few extant writings from Agnes's own pen. But the prominence of her daughter garnered attention, and much of what we know from Agnes's life comes from her daughter. Don Carlos Smith and Agnes Coolbrith were married in July of 1835 in Kirtland after the Coolbrith family had converted and moved there in 1832. With the organization of the Nauvoo Legion, Don Carlos Smith had been placed in the office of Brigadier General of the Nauvoo Legion at the ripe age of 25 years old. Don Carlos had a powerful career ahead of him as a trusted brother of the prophet, if only he wasn't opposed to his elder brother's newfound doctrine of polygamy. Robert B. Thompson left behind no writings or secondhand quotes concerning his opinions on polygamy. But if he was such close friends with Ebenezer Robinson and Don Carlos Smith, both extremely opposed to polygamy, he may have shared their similar opinions that polygamy was an abomination at this time in the church. Opponents to church doctrine must be dealt with properly. In August of 1841, tragedy struck on multiple fronts. This is from the History of the Church, Dan Vogel, Source and Text Critical Edition, Volume 4, beginning on page 389. Quote, August 7th, 1841. My younger brother, Don Carlos Smith, died at his residence in Nauvoo this morning, in the 25th year of his age. He was born 25th March, 1860. was one of the first to receive my testimony and was ordained to the priesthood when only 14 years of age. The evening after the plates of the Book of Mormon were shown to the 8 witnesses, a meeting was held when all the witnesses, as also Don Carlos, bore testimony to the truth of the Latter-day Dispensation. He accompanied Father to visit grandfather and relatives in St. Lawrence County, New York in August 1830. And it ends with, he was one of 24 elders who laid the cornerstones of the Kirtland Temple, and continues to tell Don Carlos Smith's story after that. Then, a mere 8 days later, Joseph's 1-year-old son, with the same name of Don Carlos Smith, died of an unknown illness. This was the 4th child born to Joseph and Emma, who died before they reached 2 years old. I mean, to lose a 1-year-old son a week after losing a brother, barely a year after losing a father, I mean, we can't even imagine what this must have been like. But that's not the end of it. Then we go to page 407 of Volume 4 of the Vogel History of the Church. Quote, Friday, 27th August, 1841. Elder Robert B. Thompson died at his residence in Nauvoo in the 30th year of his age, in the full hope of a glorious resurrection. He was associate editor of the Times and Seasons, colonel in the Nauvoo Legion, and had done much writing for myself and the church. After which it gives a brief biography of Thompson written by his widow, which concludes with this paragraph, quote, When the Nauvoo Legion was formed, he received the office of colonel and also aide-de-camp. In May 1841, he became associate with Don Carlos in the editing of the Times and Seasons. On the 16th of August, he was seized with the same disease of which Don Carlos had died on the 7th. The attachment between them was so strong, it seemed as though they could not long be separated. He died on the 27th, leaving 1 child, was interred in the burying ground on the 29th. By his special request, no military procession was formed at his funeral. End quote. Now that last line is rather important from Robert B. Thompson's eulogy because they did bring out the whole Nauvoo Legion in full uniform force for the funeral procession of Don Carlos Smith. These 2 men were loved OGs of Mormonism, and Don Carlos was a member of the aristocracy of Smith of Nauvoo. Their presences were sincerely missed. Now, to help tell the somber and harrowing story of Don Carlos Smith's funeral, please permit me a reading of Eliza Snow's poem about the funeral, which seems to aptly capture the collective Mormon psyche during the procession. The Funeral of Brigadier General Smith. It was a Sabbath day. The morning came, but came not with the usual joyousness, with which the consecrated day was wont in Nauvoo City ever and anon, to usher its broad radiance on a train of humble, cheerful worshippers. Nature seemed conscious of the mournful knell that broke upon the saddened heart of man. The sun arose muffled with clouds that hid his own bright beams in an effusion soft, and gentle as the soothing feeling tones of sorrow dropped a sympathetic tear. At length the clouds dispersed, the sun poured forth his glorious rays in brilliant majesty, and I beheld upon the beauteous plain that fronts the noble Mississippi's wave a mighty host, a powerful warrior band, whose rich escutcheons glittered in the sun. I heard the sound of martial music, but it came with solemn, slow, and mournful air. Unlike the bold and thrilling notes that call the restless warrior to the battlefield, there was no clash of arms, no din of war. The sword was sheathed, and every martial brow was mellowed into sadness. Mounted high, upon a fiery steed, a chieftain sat, and continued the command, and then anon. In double file, in open columns formed, with chieftains in front, then horse and foot, in solemn order, moved across the wide, extended plain the Nauvoo Legion 'twas, a splendid sight. A sight that would have charmed the eye of each beholder, but alas! That grand display was the last honors paid to the departed in the Legion's rear. Still lengthening out the vast procession walked a crowd of citizens of every rank, of either sex, and last of all closed in, a long and glittering train of carriages. I gazed upon the grand procession, till it disappeared amid the dwellings which stand thickly clustered near the river's edge. I listened. All was still. The music notes no longer sounded on the pensive breeze, but hark! The notes awakened, and I saw the mighty host returning with the same slow, melancholy tread. A hearse was borne, along with solemn yet bold martial pomp, that plainly signified a mighty one of no ordinary rank, had fallen. Near to the summit of an eminence, rising in bold relief to dignify the beauty of the verdant plain beneath, in nature's temple with no other wall than the horizon, and no other arch than the broad canopy of heaven, shaded with clustering boughs, whose foliage waves around, is raised an altar to the living God. The procession marched, it halted there, and in the front of the weeping relatives, the hearse of him was placed, whose there, in life, had been a fervent, constant worshipper. His arms and armor on his coffin lay, and other swords than his lay crossing there. His brother's officers, who formed with him the noblest military staff our fair Columbia has to boast, were seated by, in shining armor clad, but they seemed divested of the martial haughtiness. That warlike pride that fires the warrior's eye, it lay concealed beneath the brow of grief. The invocation and the sacred chant opened the solemn service of that day. And then the man of God arose. In tones of truth-impassioned eloquence, he spoke of the late sad occurrence which had touched the hearts of all and universally was calling forth a fellowship of grief. Each soldier mourned a general, each saint a brother, and each citizen a friend. But when he came to paint the glories of the world to come, wrapped in visions of eternal truth, even grief itself bowed down, and the vast multitude for once forgot to weep. And then he sweetly dwelt upon the character of the deceased, without a stain, his Christian life that seemed without a blemish, and his military course a path of honor. Though he had not stood before the cannon's mouth, although he ne'er had been in battle's front amid the rage of war and clash of arms, and although now he'd fallen according to the common course of providence, and had not perished by the sword, he was no less a patriot. He loved his country. He'd prepared himself by stepping high in military rank to do her service at her earliest call. And then the chaplain spoke of him in the retired relations of domestic life. There sat his aged, widowed mother, whom he'd honored with most filial sanctity, to whom he'd been a constant solace in those scenes of persecution and distress, which she had suffered for the gospel's sake, while as a brother he'd ever proved firm as Gibraltar's rock, true unto death. And then he come still nearer home, and touched the finest fibre of the human heart, and spoke of her, the lonely widow of the noble fallen chieftain, the bereft companion of his bosom, whom he loved with faithful tenderness. Who can now enter the halo of her feelings, soothe her grief, for him who not only could reciprocate her bosom sympathies, he too had been a loving and indulgent father to her lonely, weeping babes left fatherless. To soothe the bleeding heart, the speaker then spoke of the blessed reunion that awaits the faithful worshippers of the Most High. Thus closed the man of God, the service done. Again the great procession formed, and once again the bearers took the silent pall and bore it onward to the narrow house. Then came the parting scenery that closed the service of the living to the dead. Whether the olive branch, the cypress bough, or myrtle wreath, it matters not. 'Twas given as the last token of a profound respect. Emblem of friendship, of eternal life, the legion one by one deposited within the grave a green unwithered bough, and passing onward left the trophied urn. A voice was heard, slowly pronouncing, "Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, return this body to its mother earth." While on the coffin fell the parted clod, beside the grave the legion's playing band awoke melodious sweetest strain. A chord was touched that echoed music to the springs of life, and fell as soft upon the ear as if seraphic harpers had come down to charm the sleeper in his lowly rest. The music ceased. Another chaplain's voice, with heavenly eloquence, poured forth in prayer to the eternal God, responding past from heart to heart of this vast multitude, the morning concourse in the burial grove, and there beneath Time's monument the oak, whose umbrage waved luxurious to the breeze, they left the shrouded buried corpse of one, beloved in life and honored in his death, waiting the trump of God to call it forth, to hail its own bright spirit from the skies. The Funeral of Brigadier General Smith by Eliza Snow. The 1-year-old child of Joseph Smith, his youngest brother, and one of his closest friends all perished in a single month. Hundreds of Mormon refugees had died as a result of being driven from the comfort of their homes and forced to settle in an untamed swampland on the Mississippi. The ague, as they called it, along with rickets, malaria, cholera, a number of other equally terrible diseases plagued this Nauvoo Mormon settlement. Robert B. Thompson and Don Carlos Smith both worked in the basement of that shack in printing the Times and Seasons, which had all sorts of terrible fungi and bacteria growing from the saturated walls with absolutely no ventilation. These were merely 3 more casualties among piles of dead Mormons who'd preceded Thompson and Smith's in death. But we can't lose sight of what it must have been like for the Mormons to lose a prominent and beloved member of the Smith family to illness, along with another extremely early Mormon who'd been a member of the elite since the early Kirtland years. These diseases didn't play by any rule book. But all of that said, there is another interpretation or explanation for these deaths, which requires brief examination at the least. This is from Andrew F. Smith's biography of John C. Reckitt Bennett, titled The Saintly Scoundrel, The Life and Times of Dr. John Cook Bennett. I'm reading this from page 80. Quote, "Whatever happened, Bennett and Smith clearly had a temporary parting of ways. Bennett, who had been living with Joseph Smith's family, moved into other quarters." This is the important part. "A few weeks later, Don Carlos Smith and Robert B. Thompson died after short illnesses. Their deaths have been attributed to an epidemic then rampaging through Nauvoo. However, Bennett was later reported to have said that Don Carlos Smith had been murdered, and that Joseph Smith, quote, believed Bennett poisoned him, end quote. No evidence has surfaced to indicate that the cause of Don Carlos's death was anything other than natural, end quote. Yes, no evidence has surfaced to lead historians to believe that Don Carlos Smith and Robert B. Thompson were poisoned. The consensus explanation of death by epidemic is plenty sufficient to explain their deaths. But let's run on that latter assumption for just a moment, very briefly. What if they were poisoned, as Andrew Smith contests that Joseph believed in making the accusation against Reckitt Bennett? Why? Why would somebody want these 2 men dead? Well, polygamy was kept deep under wraps in the church. Mormonism operated under the law of common consent, which is basically how the church was and currently is able to masquerade as a democratic institution. Every 6 months, when members vote to sustain the leadership, they are invoking their right of common consent. Issues in the early church were resolved with healthy deliberation and debate, and a unanimous vote was usually reached after the elders argued a bit. Doctrine, revelations, civil actions, everything was up for debate and voted on by the elite in the church, and anything affecting the wider populace was voted on in general conferences. Joseph Smith knew that polygamy would never pass as public doctrine with unanimous common consent. So, he decided to practice it anyway and keep it all underground. Now, this is purely speculating here. Take that for what it's worth. But Don Carlos Smith was a vocal opponent of polygamy. And if Robert B. Thompson was also just as opposed, being such a close friend of Don Carlos, these men had access to loads of information and people who would prove to them beyond a shadow of a doubt that polygamy was being practiced behind closed doors. They were probably just ignoring an elephant in the room at this point. Should Joe's own brother and secretary go public with information which proved the prophet was having affairs, try to imagine the fallout from that. Would Joseph Smith poison his own brother to keep polygamy under wraps? Doubtful, right? would John C. Reckitt Bennett poison 2 men to keep polygamy secret without Joseph's knowledge? Who knows? Many historians regard Reckitt Bennett as a truly deplorable human being. Now, this whole issue is significantly complicated when we consider the fact that a mere 5 months after this, Joseph Smith married the widow of his late brother, Agnes Coolbrith, who we spoke about earlier. Now, this was based on Levitical teachings that a wife needed to be passed to her husband's brother upon her husband's death. And Joe was kind enough to give Agnes an entire 3 months to mourn her husband's death before he began courting her. We shouldn't use the fact that this marriage fit into the Levitical commandments as the best way to explain why Joe took Agnes as his wife. Agnes was beautiful. She was 8 years older than Don Carlos, yet only 3 years younger than Joseph. She had shown affection towards both Joe and Hiram with that letter that she sent to them in Liberty Jail. So to claim that Joe married Agnes Coolbrith simply out of obligation to biblical polygamy would be ignoring his motivations for every one of his marriages which weren't Levitical. So take the deaths of Robert P. Thompson, Don Carlos Smith, and the subsequent marriage of Joseph to Don Carlos's widow, however you will. This is the information that's available to us. And I don't expect that any documentary evidence is ever going to surface that they were indeed poisoned, so that's why it's mere speculation, but I'm not the only person who thinks that it might be a possibility. But let's go back to that point about common consent, because that's how we're going to make today's history lesson relevant to the church as it stands today. Common consent is still part of the church. It just so happens that opposition occurs so rarely that I doubt the leadership even has their own guidelines to deal with people who vote to oppose something when they are asking for those sustaining votes. The church doesn't have to keep polygamy under wraps anymore because they outlawed it in the late 1890s. But what other issues? Much less salacious issues. This upcoming march to Protect LDS Children is a way to inform the leadership from the outside that people want the church to change in some way. But that doesn't hold as much influence as people voting in opposition when the call to sustain the leadership inevitably happens the Sunday following the march, during their petition for common consent and unanimous voting. But we can't lose sight of the fact that the church today isn't the same church that Joseph Smith established or led, but some of the better aspects of his original church still survive today. Common consent. If we want change to happen, marching to the church office building isn't enough. The next action I can see having any sort of impact on the church would be to resurrect the Any Opposed movement and get the church to change its policies on these bishops' interviews by standing up in general conference and voicing opposition. We must be like water and adapt to the situation, because the church isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It will continue its parasitic relationship with reality and cause droves of children to kill themselves for the shame they endure. The church will continue to force well-intentioned people of all ages and sexes to compartmentalize reality apart from their beliefs. It will always have a hand in Utah government. Short of outlawing the church altogether, which some of you may be surprised to hear this, but I'm wholly not in favor of outlawing the church, opposing the church and its leadership from the inside by invoking common consent is the most effective way to drag it kicking and screaming into the 21st century. All right, everyone, we're just about to get into an interview with Lydia Finch, and be sure to stick around after that interview to hear the necessary details surrounding the Protect LDS Children March and what will be going on afterwards there. But first, I need to take a quick break and talk to you about our sponsor this week, HelloFresh. I've been talking about HelloFresh for a long time because I've been a subscriber for quite a while now. HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service that shops, plans, and delivers your favorite step-by-step recipes and pre-measured ingredients, so all you have to do is open up the box, cook, eat, and enjoy the delicious food. Last recipe that I had was this garden quesadillas with pico de gallo and chipotle mayo. It's a vegetarian meal, which I typically don't go hardcore vegetarian, but this one was really delicious. It came with red onion, zucchini, bell peppered, Roma tomato, and everything else that you need for these quesadillas, and it was absolutely delicious. Listeners of this show are offered a special code, NAKED30. If you go to HelloFresh.com and enter that promo code, you're going to get $30 off your first week of meal delivery service. It's extremely convenient. All you have to do is log in, choose your delivery date for when it works best for your busy schedule. You can pause your account for weeks at a time when you're out of town, and all of these ingredients come in these pre-measured, handy labeled meal kits, so you know which ingredients go with which recipe, and it's delivered right to your door in recyclable, insulated packaging. It's extremely healthy. There's a vast array of benefits it provides. It's easy to cook, it's delicious, and the meals are less than $10 a piece. It's absolutely amazing. It's the next generation of how home cooking is going to be. And the best part about it is you don't just order the food and have it delivered. You also get to cook it. You get to add your own seasonings. You get to get the joy of what it is to be cooking and have everything in pre-measured ingredients. And you can feel confident when you're cooking with it because of the extremely simple picture-by-picture, step-by-step recipe cards that are included. And it comes with incredible notable recipes. It wasn't just the garden quesadillas. We also have sweet apple pork tenderloins, Tex-Mex tilapia, Mediterranean baked veggies, over 2,500 easy-to-cook meals that are specially crafted by HelloFresh chefs. It's extremely simple, too. You're not going to spend hours cooking. Each meal only takes about 30 minutes. There's lots of one-pot recipes for seriously speeding cooking and minimal cleanup. And each week there's a 20-minute meal on the classic menu for when you really are strapped for that time. HelloFresh provides a bunch of selection and flexibility as well. They offer a wide variety of these chef-curated recipes, and they change weekly. There's 3 different plans to choose from. You got the classic veggie and the family for those family listeners out there. The classic comes with a variety of meat, fish, and seasonal produce. The veggie comes with vegetarian recipes with plant-based proteins, grains, and seasonal produce. And the family package comes with quick and easy meals with all the yum-worthy flavors the whole family will love. So if you've thought about getting a meal delivery service and you maybe have shopped some of these around, you might want to give HelloFresh a try. It's really fantastic, and I swear by it being a subscriber. Go to HelloFresh.com and be sure to enter promo code NAKED30. You're going to get that $30 off of your first week of deliveries. You can't get a deal better than that. Once again, that's HelloFresh.com/naked30. Back to the show. History can help us understand a number of human phenomena. With taking a singular instance of these phenomena and comparing them with similar occurrences, we can tease out some interesting patterns. What better way to understand religion than by studying multiple religious organizations? Our next guest is Lydia Finch. Lydia wants to expose the workings of religions and cults to the scientific and skeptical communities and show why, although Jehovah's Witnesses are considered a small fringe religion, their policies should concern the wider community. Lydia Finch was born and raised a Jehovah's Witness, but left the organization at age 18 over 20 years ago. Recently, she has directed her attention to the harmful practices of the Jehovah's Witnesses and other cults, such as shunning, child abuse, and the forbidding of blood transfusions. Lydia, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to use some comparative analyses here and see if we can find any similar patterns between the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormon religion, because this is a show about Mormonism. We got to add that extra little tinge to the interview here. But I want to start off by getting a little bit of your take on what it is that makes Jehovah's Witnesses, as you consider it, as you claim it, to be a cult. What is it that makes it seem to be a cult?
Okay. I don't know whether you or your listeners would have heard of, there's a thing called the bite model, which is, Stephen Hassan has researched cults, and that's his model for determining whether something is a cult. And that is that they will have control over your behavior, your information, your thinking, and your emotions. So, basically what makes Jehovah's Witnesses more of a cult rather than a religion is the control that they have over their adherents, let's call them. So they they will try to control things you do, decisions you make, your behavior, stuff like that.
So how is it that this control is exerted, from an organizational standpoint, as well as kind of like a boots on the ground type of, similar tendencies that they seem to use in order to exercise control?
With Jehovah's Witness, and this has kind of got more extreme over time, but if you don't obey their teachings, or they determine that you are going against their teachings, then you have the threat of expulsion. And then what that will mean is when you are, say, thrown out of the community, you can have no contact with anyone in the community.
Wow.
Like, for instance, for me, I was thrown out when I was 18. And since that time, I've had my mum can't have any contact with me. My sisters can't have any contact with me. No one I grew up with can have any contact with me. A Jehovah's Witness on the street can't talk to me. So it's that extreme. And that is fundamentally, that is the threat. But also you've got, especially when you grow up, you've got that element of thought control, behavior control from when you're born. So you will have that inbuilt guilt about going against the organization, but there is that very real threat of consequences if you go against it, and that's what sets apart a cult from a religion.
It sounds, I'll just introduce a little bit about Mormonism here, because Mormonism definitely does a similar version of shunning. However, it seems like the Jehovah's Witness shunning is Mormonism's on steroids. Like it seems to be a step above and beyond, where the people who are, essentially excised or excommunicated from this community, you don't come back. I mean, is there a way to gain the penance and to return into the organization after you've been exed?
There is. It's called reinstatement. And what will happen with reinstatement is you have to go back to they have meetings 3 times a week, and you have to go back to their meetings for a certain period of time. There's no set time that it can vary. It could be months, a year. I know a couple who did it for 3 years. But you go back to those meetings, and when you go, no one can talk to you. You can't talk to anybody. You need a lot of places. You will have to sit at the back of the hall. You have to come in late, so you can't talk to anyone. You have to leave early, so no one can talk to you. And you have to go through that. And then when the elders, which are the leaders in the congregation, when they decide at some point that you are worthy again, then you can be reinstated, and then you will be known as Jehovah's Witness again, and then your family can talk to you again, and the community can kind of talk to you again. So there is a way back, but even that way back is incredibly difficult.
I'm struck with this level of control that they are able to exert. Tell us a little bit about the Watchtower organization itself, because as I understand, this is kind of the directing body over the church. Is that correct?
Yeah. Basically, the structure is you've got governing body is like the top guys. I think there's 8 now. There was 7. There are like 8 guys in America who are anointed, apparently. Of course. But they basically have complete control over the whole organization, and they have control about what is said in the meetings and what goes into the literature and what is given out to that's called the rank and file. And then you've got...
Sorry, what file?
Rank and file. That's kind of how...
Oh, the rank and file. I'm sorry.
So
I misunderstood you.
The normal people.
The chapel attending ones. Yeah, absolutely.
And then you've got... It's really complicated because there's quite a few different organizations kind of under the umbrella. But so you've got governing body, and then you have the organization that produces the literature, and then you have districts and circuits, and then you have congregations, and within the congregations you have elders, and under the elders you have ministerial servants. There's so many levels of authority between the normal person and but every single person, right down to the rank and file member, has to adhere to everything to the T, or they will be. It's called disfellowshipped, which is a weird word. But that's.
I'm familiar with the word, actually. Yeah.
Is that a word you use as well? Because
yeah, Mormons use that and excommunicated as well.
Oh, right.
So, yeah, it's I'm seeing a lot of similar themes kind of being teased out.
Every time I've typed that in, it's like my spell check is like, that is not even a word.
Us fellow ex-cultists, we know.
Right?
we know what's up.
It's weird because there's a whole, as you know, there's a whole vocabulary that you have that you know, and other ex-members know, but people, kind of outsiders, let's call them, like, what's that word even mean?
Gentiles, yes.
Worldly.
Yeah, and I found even like in the ex-Mormon community, the ex-Mormons have their own terminology that they use to talk about the church itself that Mormons aren't familiar with. So it's nested a couple levels.
And this is I did a course in London with someone called Alexandra Stein, who is also a cult expert, and she was in a cult herself. And as part of the course that you actually discuss this, that is part of cults, is they have their own language, and it's a part of kind of bonding. It's a way of bonding the people together, but also separating them from the outside.
Absolutely. Well, I've told the listeners a couple of times that my name is still on the church records, because I found it extremely useful to be able to tell members in conversation with them that I am a member, that I grew up in Utah, because suddenly they see me as an insider, and then we have a completely different conversation than we would have if they knew that I was not attending the church anymore and consider myself not a believer in it. So I'm sure that you kind of experience a similar thing with Jehovah's Witnesses too. If they hear like some little word that shows that you're an outsider or that you're not actually genuine, then I'm sure the conversation completely changes.
I mean, as soon as I've had this even on Twitter, as soon as they know I'm disfellowshipped, they will block me because they don't have to talk to me. And if, because I do know some ex-witnesses go up to the carts, like where they're preaching in the street, and we'll start a conversation. But if you kind of let it slip that you know more than, say, an outsider would know, they become quite suspicious. It's like, you know too much. And they kind of close down.
Yeah. One thing I'm struck with the Jehovah's Witnesses particularly is how much they actively try to disconnect themselves from politics. Right. And tell us a little bit about that. How is that done? How does that kind of play out?
Okay, so their whole thing is to be separate from the world. So you're not allowed, no Jehovah's Witnesses are allowed to vote at all. Like my mum, my whole family, no Jehovah's Witness votes at all. If they are in a country where you have to, where it's compulsory, they will go and they will ruin the ballot. That's what they have to do. And then it's crazy, right?
I mean, I'm sorry, I have to point this out. Like a religion who is actively saying that you can't vote because people, we don't want to exert our political control in any way, shape, or form. That is a level of exerting political control when you make sure that people are unable to vote. Like that is a direct violation of, a church that is infringing on a political right that everybody has. Wow. Okay.
And there are so many human rights issues with them. And that is another one, is that you literally, you have no say. They take that power away from you to have a say about how your life is going to be and how your country is going to be. And, I mean, I think the idea is that you are putting your faith in God's government coming at some point, maybe. Mm-hmm. So if you are voting, then you are putting some sort of, hope in man, I guess. So yeah, they're completely have nothing to do with politics whatsoever.
Wow, very interesting. So let's talk a little bit more about the Watchtower organization specifically, because everything that they say is turned into scripture basically and they chug out a ton of literature as far as I'm aware.
So much.
Tell us about the Watchtower magazine.
Okay, so the Watchtower magazine, apparently it's much. I've not actually looked in a physical magazine for a long time, but I think they're a lot thinner than they used to be. But that is the magazine that on a Sunday, like on a Sunday morning, or Sunday afternoon, you'll have public talk, which is about an hour, and then you study the Watchtower article. So that's what it's taken from, and people have to answer questions. But that's basically their avenue of that. That's where the doctrine comes from. And it's meant to be based on scripture, but it changes. Their doctrine changes all the time. They call it, you'll like this. This is a Jehovah's Witness word, new light.
New light. Wow.
New light. When they change,
light the world.
When they change doctrine, yeah, they're like, oh, this is new light. And you're like, you just changed your mind. Okay. And it's usually date related because they've made a lot of predictions about the end of the world and Armageddon.
Of course.
So, usually they're like, okay, it's getting a bit close now. Maybe we should rethink it. And so anyway, so the Watchtower is their main literature, I would say. And that's the one they will try to give to, people on the street. That will be on their cards.
I'm struck with how the Sunday worship is handled, where it's basically mandatory to read the Watchtower magazine. There's a somewhat similar practice when it comes to Mormonism. We have what we call home teaching, where you have the designated elders or high priests that just go around to families in the community, and they read out of what's known as the Ensign or the New Era or whatever church specific periodical magazine is newest that month. And they read the First Presidency message usually, and, they give a lesson on it in, however much depth they're comfortable with, reciting, but it's not mandatory. That, when I said that, Jehovah's Witness is like, Mormonism control on steroids, it's like, at some levels, it seems like with this, Mormonism has its kid gloves on, whereas Jehovah's Witness has on like spike gauntlets or something that they're, controlling the community with. I can't help but escape seeing how similar they are, but how much more extreme Jehovah's Witnesses seems. So it does seem like, with the level of control and the, essentially forcing the members to read their literature specifically is kind of at the next level when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses compared to Mormonism in this respect.
Yeah, I mean, like on a Sunday when you meant to study the articles before you go to the meeting, and then you read a paragraph, their last question, someone has to put their hand up and answer the question, and it's just kind of repetitive and just kind of just trying to get these thoughts and behaviors kind of stuck in your head. And it's just constant repetition. And it's only actually now when I go back that I can see how manipulative the language is and how there's a lot of suggestion.
Interesting.
Lots of things like, a true Christian would do this.
Of course.
Honestly, especially when you're brought up in it, you don't even notice those things. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what I should think. Because obviously I'm a Christian, therefore that's what I think. And, But it's full of stuff like that just kind of loaded language, manipulative language, that just kind of leads you down the right path. I use the phrase ironically, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, right. Yeah. The right path. What is it that, cause as far as I understand, you're actually studying cults right now. You're at university studying this. And so
I'm studying psychology and counseling. I have an interest in cults, and I did a relatively short course on it.
Okay. So then, I mean, you invoked Stephen Hassan and his bite model earlier, and I would like to talk about, kind of dive a little bit deeper into the weeds there and see what we can kind of tease out of this. What is it specifically that we can point to that are markers that show something contributing into the bite model? Because we have behavior, information, thought, and emotion. What is it that we see kind of playing into those pieces that are, kind of specific instances that show that the bite model is being used, or that this is actually a cult?
Okay, so so behavior. An easy one for that, with regards to the witnesses, is blood transfusions. That is a huge cornerstone of their doctrine, is that you cannot have a blood transfusion. Even if your life is in danger, even if you're going to die, you cannot have a blood transfusion. And if you do, then you are disfellowshipped, excommunicated, whatever you want to call it, from the community and the organization. So that's
But that's just one egregious example of it, though, too. But I mean, there are plenty of other things that play into behavior, whether it's, controlling your 3 meetings a week and what you're reading there, and, how you treat ex-members, by shunning. I mean, all of these kind of go into behavior, right?
It's hard to, I think it's hard to explain to people from the outside that literally everything you do, everything is controlled by the organization. You cannot have sex before marriage. Sorry for anyone, but you cannot masturbate. They will take interest in your sex life even within a marriage. You have to report your preaching hours every single month. If you don't, then the elders will come and talk to you. You cannot even...
Your preaching hours?
Yeah, basically you...
Every member a missionary type of thing?
Every single... Okay, so I'm mentally rewinding. I'm like, how far back do I... Okay, so now I know. So basically, especially when you grow up or when you join when you're older, before you get baptized, which is when you formally dedicate yourself to the organization, basically, you will become what's called an unbaptized publisher, which is when you are officially allowed to go and knock on people's doors and talk to people and give them literature, stuff like that. Oh. But at that point, when you become that, you then have to, every month, you have to report how many hours you've done and how many magazines you've left, how many Bible studies you've done. And from that point, if you go, I'll get this wrong. I think if you go like a month or 2 months without reporting any, then you'll definitely be approached by the elders in the congregation to see why. And then possibly be called, be classed as an inactive member. But I remember my mum filling out these forms that you then have to put in a box at the hall. And I remember how guilty she felt for not doing enough. Like, she had 6 children. It's like, and she felt so guilty every single month. And everyone does it. You grow up with it and it's all like super normal. But I mean, that's not normal.
No. I mean, especially because people have day jobs too, and they're committed to doing these proselyting hours. I mean, it's a great way to mobilize a sales force for the church, but I mean, still, it's kind of disturbing to say the least.
When I left school at 16, because also here's another behaviour thing is you're not allowed to go on to further education. So I left school at many leave at 16. I think it's 18 now because the laws changed, but you're definitely heavily, heavily, heavily discouraged from going to university, which is why I'm just doing it now, like many years later.
And is that for men and women as well, or just women?
Everyone, because it's dangerous to go to university. It's dangerous. Better the university, the more dangerous it is. That's straight from the governing body. It's so dangerous. Don't do it. So,
that's. I'm sorry. That is truly astonishing. I mean,
controlling your education as well, and obviously, and there's within this might make you laugh. Within the Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't know whether this is worldwide or whether it's a UK thing, but within Jehovah's Witnesses, there's a lot of window cleaners. Every man seems to be.
I was going to say, you're going to have a congregation of nothing but welders and house cleaners? I mean, how is that sustainable?
I know, but you know what, also, I'm going off on a tangent here, but, and the problem is with that is they're missing a trick because they ask constantly for donations, but they're asking from people who have no good jobs, and you've stopped them getting decent jobs. So they have no money to give you, but you keep asking them for money. So their model needs work.
Yeah, there's a couple of holes here.
Okay, so I left school at 16, and there's there's quite a big pressure on youngsters, let's call them, to become a pioneer. So you've got two levels of pioneers. Okay. You've got auxiliary pioneer and regular pioneer. Auxiliary you do month by month, like you can do just 1 month, whereas a regular pioneer will do round the year. And I was an auxiliary pioneer, and that meant I had to do 60 hours a month preaching.
60 hours
60 hours a month. And my sister was a regular pioneer, and she had to do 90 hours a month.
Whoa. That is... goodness.
We got nothing for it. We got no support. We got no financial... Yeah. You get nothing back for it. Plus, you have to then work to kind of live around that as well. And then you would have to, obviously, and then you will report those hours. So I did that for maybe a couple of years. I think my sister's still doing it like 20 years later.
My goodness. So these are all methods of behavior control, and that's actually controlling down to what you are doing on a day-to-day basis. They are keeping you extremely busy with going out there proselyting. You can hand out the watchtower, you can hand out the tracts from the church, but you can't take any information from outsiders. Very insular, while at the same time, trying to spread as much as possible. I find that quite fascinating. I want to hit on something else with behavior control as well, and that's how you said a number of times the elders approach you.
Yeah.
Do they call you into their office and sit you down and say, hey, you are doing this wrong, you need to change, you need to reform, and basically do these kind of interview things to see how you're doing, to get you to confess your sins? I mean, how is it that they kind of exert their control, boots on the ground model that way?
Again, it's unless you actually get approached by them, you'll never know what happens. But
really?
Yeah, I mean, people... And this is part of cult control, is that people friends, family, will report you to the elders for behavior that's not correct.
Of course.
And at that
community
point,
policing itself.
Exactly. And at that point, they had this thing called a counseling, I think it is a counseling shepherding visit. That's what that is. Shepherding visit, which is when the elders will come to your house and talk to you. You could so their halls generally have a kind of back room, kind of second, like minor hall, and they will take you in there and talk to you. Or if you've done something really, really bad and you may get disfellowship for it. They have something called a judicial committee, which is 3 elders. And then basically they will make some sort of decision about what happens to you, whether you repent enough or not.
Wow.
And really at that point, they have complete control over even if you leave, they have complete complete control over the rest of your life. They have control over whether you lose your family or not.
Let's use that as a jump-off point, because we've discussed behavior and information a fair amount. Let's talk about thought, because what you're hitting on right now is how they control your very thoughts. What does that look like in Jehovah's Witnesses?
Well, I think it's probably more to do with there's a lot of guilt about things you're thinking, about the organization. You're not allowed to think, you're really not allowed to think about the opposite sex at all. So that is, wow. You need to nip that in the bud. And they do, I mean, in their literature will actually say these kinds of things, that if you are having these impure thoughts, then you need to address them and you need to find to stop those thoughts.
I mean, it seems like so many religions do hit on controlling sexuality, because that's deep human emotions. That's programmed, hardwired way into our humanity. And if you can exert control over that, you have somebody at some of their most basic instincts, pandering to you. That's really powerful.
And this is, this is something you will notice in almost, actually probably all cults, is they will exert some control over sex or procreation. In some, they stop people having children. In others, they force them to have children. They force abortions. I mean, Children of God, they even forced child abuse. And it is something you see in almost every single one. There is an element of that control over that. Because I think that is just, when you look at it, that's the most basic urge, humans and relationships. And if you can control that, then you've got someone, I think.
I'm sitting here stunned, just thinking of the similarities in my own experience, and I will let the listeners draw their own conclusions about the similarities they may or may not have experienced, whether it's in Mormonism or any other religion. And we're going to pick back up on that in just a second, but I want to get to the emotion part of Hassan's bite model. What is it that you see as Jehovah's Witnesses exerting control over emotion, or just any cult for that matter?
Okay, so you have two ends of the spectrum. Is you've got extreme love bombing, which is really common in most cults, and you've got
love bombing.
So what? Yeah. Do you know about love bombing?
I'm sure that I can come up with some kind of definition for it, where they just heap a hefty load of love on you constantly for doing something good, right?
That is generally love bombing. Bombing happens in the beginning stages. Say somebody is coming in, everyone will be like heaping love and praise and everything on them, and they'll be like, "This is amazing! Wow, this is great! I want to be in this community." So you've got that, you've got the extreme love, but then you've got extreme fear on the other end of the spectrum. And so I left 20 years ago, and I stopped having nightmares about Armageddon 5 years ago. Wow. I mean, the indoctrination, the constant imagery, they talk about death a lot, and like in really extreme ways. There's this public talk where they talk about bodies lying in the street, and there's just too many. Like, even if you let all the animals out of the zoo, they still can eat all these bodies, and there'll be putrefying flesh everywhere. And the people in the audience are actually they're kind of laughing at this. You get to a point where you're so desensitized. But for me,
you laugh so you don't cry or break down into, wow.
Great. And the imagery they use is there's lots of like fireballs from the sky, lots of crumbling buildings, dead bodies. And you hear that from when you're born. And so even when I left, because when I left, I kind of did it in a weird way, because when I left, I still believed it. And I didn't stop believing it until about 5 years ago. It was only when I stopped believing it that I stopped having the nightmares. Because once I left, I thought, well, that's it. I'm going to die now. Armageddon's coming and I'm going to die. So I would have these nightmares weekly about Armageddon. And they were so real to me, and it was just a real thing that was going to happen.
I have to point out that is straight up mental child abuse. I mean, child abuse isn't just physical; that is emotional and thought abuse for children. That's terrible.
I mean, I was thinking today there probably is something worse, but like, how bad is it to raise a child to believe they are going to die a horrible death if they disobey? Like, I have a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I can't imagine putting them under that strain. I can't imagine putting that thought in their head that they're going to die.
Well, and also presenting to them that the bipolarity of the fear and the love of, God loves you, but he is also, if you displease him, he will send you to this dark and evil place that even your imagination can't construct how terrible it really is. So, I mean, it's also presented as this great axiom that can't be overcome of love and fear. And it seems like when it's taught at such a young age, it forces children to filter so much of what they view in the world through that kind of bipolar lens, which is not healthy. It forces people to classify, shades of gray as pure black and white. It's not okay.
The way they talk about death and stuff like that is odd. Once you've come out of it, you're like, it's so, they talk about millions, like, because they believe everyone will die but Jehovah's Witnesses. Everyone's going to die at Armageddon. And they quite, openly talk about the fact that, everyone's going to have to bury all these bodies. I'm like, that does not sound like a thing I want to do. But and they kind of, they make you afraid, but they also desensitize you to a certain extent. So.
And how do you mean that? By how is it that they desensitize you from what they're telling you, or from the world around you, or what is it?
I think they desensitize you to the idea of death, to to really actually think, what is this like? This person is going, all these people are going to die, and I think because you're so assured that you will be saved if you just do what they ask you to do. You, especially growing up in it, you become desensitized to even the idea of death. Because it's talked about so much in this way that it is a good thing, that millions of people are going to die, and that's a good thing. And finally, God is going to be vindicated. And you're like, and then when you come out, you kind of have a weird relationship, I guess, with the idea of death, because. And also they believe in resurrection. So anytime you had someone close to you that did die, it was kind of, you could be sad, but it was always like, oh, they're coming back, so don't worry. So you have quite a complicated relationship with death.
Yeah. I want to ask you, and this may be our kind of a final question to wrap this conversation up. I understand that classifying a religion as a cult is a harsh distinction. There is a difference between a religion and a cult. And when members of a religion are told from an outsider that they are a member of a cult, it's easy to become very infuriated and cause them to not listen to anything else that is said after they are, called a cult member, basically. So how is it in your mind that we draw a distinction between a religion and a cult? And obviously it has nothing to do with the size of it, but much more with its mechanism of operation.
Thank you for that. I've had this conversation so many times, and lots of people do think it's just size.
Yeah.
And it's okay.
But it's so much deeper than that.
Yeah. I've had this conversation a lot because I believe religions can be cults. Not every cult is a religion.
Okay.
You can have a religion that is not a cult. And it's the way I see it is it's the amount of control they exert on your life that sets it apart. Like, you can have people that go to church on a Sunday morning, but that church is not saying you cannot have life-saving surgery, or you have to not talk to your family now. And I think with some religions, though, I think there's a spectrum. Jehovah's Witnesses, to me, lay very clearly in the cult area. But you will get other religions, say Judaism, for instance, where you've got a full range of how devout people are and how much control they have exerted over their life. But also there's this feeling that a cult is just religion, but it's not. There's lots of cults out there that are political as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's where it gets confusing.
Yeah, and non-theistic as well. Cults that are, gaming groups and stuff like that. I mean, yeah.
That's why when you look at the cult experts, they will have this criteria that doesn't involve that. It doesn't involve a god or whatever. It's purely looking at the behaviors of the organization rather than what they believe. Because, so like Scientology has some weird beliefs. Jehovah's Witnesses have some weird beliefs. But if you strip the belief away, you can see what they're doing. And it's the control and the leaders and the structure of the organization that can show you it's a cult as opposed to what they believe.
It almost seems like there's a line between religion and what a religion is and the cult method by which a religion operates. And when a religion does use, strike some of these cult tendencies in order to operate or perpetuate or get more, followers, I think that's where we can stand up and say, this is a problem. There's something going on here. We need to examine this. We need to understand it. We need to understand that this specific religion is striking some cult-like tendencies. And when those crop up, we need to keep our eye out for them. Like, we need to take notice of that when it happens and point out the similarities among every cult that we are able to see and kind of tease out. So, it's an important endeavor.
I think a part of the problem is that there are a lot of cults that are protected under the religion umbrella. And nobody wants to, freedom of religion. Yeah, I get that. But you can't just put it's a religion so they can abuse children. You need to kind of, a lot of behaviors are being protected under that.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like just about any system of beliefs can say we're a religion and then get away with incredible latitudes when it comes to the law.
Which is why this is why you need the law to say, okay, if a child comes to you, because like Jehovah's Witnesses, if a child reports they've been sexually abused to an elder in the congregation, they won't do anything about it unless there's 2 witnesses to the abuse. And they won't tell the elder.
Which is just astonishing to me. That is absolutely disgusting.
And they won't tell the police. Now, what we need,
of course,
is the law to say, you cannot do that. You need to report it. Because they will behave how they behave. But you can't let them get away with stuff just because they are a religion or cult either. So, yeah.
I have to say, this conversation has been equal parts enlightening as well as frustrating. And why I say frustrating is because it causes me to reflect on so many aspects of the religion that I am familiar with and that I grew up in, Mormonism, and understand so many similar tendencies. And we may not have discussed them in too much detail because we haven't had enough time to really, get into the weeds on some of these points. But, I would recommend any listeners out there, pop into the ex-Mormon subreddit and then over to the XJW subreddit and compare stories of people that have left and are angry and frustrated and are angry at the cult that they came out of and are unable to speak with their parents, their family members, their children, their cousins.
I mean, I would urge anyone that's come out to connect with any other ex-members, because you will find, like, ex-Muslims, ex-ultra-Orthodox Jews, you will find ex-Scientology.
Absolutely.
And this is what is amazing, that you leave and you realize it's all the same. It's the same stuff. Wherever, and that helped me actually to recover from it.
Well, and maybe that gets to the central point of, why I introduced you, because we can see these similar phenomenon occurring into the religious community. And I think it really helps when we examine them comparatively and when we try and tease out the patterns and say, why do humans do this? Why do these things exist in their current form? I think it's probably a worthwhile endeavor to try and examine those, or at least have a passing familiarity with them. Yeah. So, Lydia, I want to give you just a few minutes to add in any thoughts. Is there anything that we missed that you would like to, leave the listeners off with? Any thoughts or any extra things that you think people should seek out? And just give us our kind of your wrapping up thoughts.
Oh, now I'm on the spot. I get, I've done some YouTube videos and I get quite a lot of people kind of emailing me, and it's really hard when you leave, and it's very isolating when you leave. I left pre-internet because I'm that old. But really connecting with other people, especially from where you've just left. And as we've just said, like other from other people, other kind of organizations. Because then you can kind of find a community, and what these organizations do, that's the power they have, is that they isolate you when you leave, which is the thing that stops you going, or the thing that brings you back. But if you connect with other people, then you kind of take that power back.
And don't give in to the shame controlling mechanism of the society. It operates on shame and fear. It's
try not to.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I just think it's, I've been out for 20 years, but it's still really hard because those thought processes that are programmed into you from birth are so hard to overcome, but being aware of them will help you kind of get past it, I think.
Lydia, is there anywhere that you would like to send people if they want to reach out with you and connect with you?
I am on Twitter, Stickpins. Don't ask. It's at Finch Lydia. I'm on Facebook as well, Lydia Finch. There, that's it.
Fantastic. And I will leave links in the show notes for your Facebook and Twitter pages. Lydia Finch, this has been wonderful and enlightening. Thank you so very much for sharing everything you have with us today. This has been really good. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, that does it for our interview with Lydia Finch. I will let you, as the listeners, decide if you see any similarities between what Lydia Finch was describing with the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism. I think she really let us in on some incredibly crucial information when it comes to identifying and understanding the mechanisms by which cults tend to operate, and seeing if we can tease out any similar tendencies in large religions that many of us may have practiced or currently do practice. So that's going to do it for the meat for today's episode, but let's talk about the Protect LDS Children March. This is coming up. It's fast approaching, and this is an important cause. March 30th, 2018 at noon. We're meeting up at Washington Square Park on March 30th at noon, and we're marching 5 blocks to the church office building, where Sam Young is going to hand deliver the petition of Protect LDS Children, along with the stories that have been collected over the entire campaign since October 2017, to the church office building in one folder. Now, this is very important and crucial to understand that the more people that are there, the more this is going to have an impact. The more that the cameras and the people will be paying attention. This is also General Conference weekend. There will be a lot of people, Mormons, that have flown in from out of town who will be attending, who flew in on Friday morning, Friday afternoon, and they'll be tooling around Temple Square, and they may be able to see that there are hundreds of people possibly gathered at the church office building in this march for protecting LDS children. This is a monumental history-writing event. If you are able to attend with us, if you can get that time off of work, I know it's on a Friday at noon. This is important, and we really hope that you will be there. Now, after the delivery has been made to the church office building, we're going to be marching the entire movement to a local park where we're going to be sitting and lingering and mingling and having a good time together. I'm actually going to set up a table there, and I'm just going to have like an email newsletter sign-up sheet and some stickers and some cards, and possibly some affiliate cards. So I will be planted in basically one central location of this march. If you happen to be attending, I'd really, like it if you came up and said, hi, I'd really like to meet you and shake your hand and thank you for being a listener. And if you happen to have a blog or a podcast or something that you would like to promote that you happen to have cards or stickers of, be sure to bring those along. Bring a stack of them and we'll put it on the table. This table is just going to be kind of a catch-all for everybody's information where you can come and talk to me or to other people that may be around the table. Who knows? We might have a few chairs for people to sit down and chat for a while. We'll see how all of this kind of plays out. But I did get the approval of the March organizers to set up a table there. So I hope to see you at the park after this march. And if you're planning on attending the march and you're looking for an evening activity, you have a couple of options. All right. John DeLynn, that's Mormon Stories podcast and Mormon Stories Foundation host, that he's the figurehead. John DeLynn, if you don't know that name, just Google it. He's going to be hosting a potluck event with karaoke. And that's going to be at 9th South and 3rd East from all I could tell, beginning at 7:30 p.m. In case a karaoke potluck is not your cup of tea, as one might say it, and you don't want to go to this karaoke night, friend of the show Doug Hoffling at Squatters Pub has been nice enough to reserve the 3rd floor of Squatters Pub for us to mingle and enjoy each other's company. So that's where I'm going to be on the evening of the march. So we're going to kick off the hangout at 7 p.m. at Squatters Pub. That's at 147 West Broadway, and Broadway is 300 South. And we're starting at 7 p.m. It's free admission. It'll be a cash bar. All ages are welcome with an accompanying adult, as per Utah law. And at 8 o'clock, I'm actually going to be giving a presentation on the history of bishops' interviews and common consent in the church. That presentation shouldn't go too long, and then we're just going to hang out as late as everybody wants to. Maybe we'll play a game, peppered into the presentation. We'll see how it goes. So, once again, if you don't want to go to John DeLynn's hangout, you can go to Squatters Pub and come hang out with me and anyone else that happens to come along. We're going to be plugging it at various locations, and while we're at the table at the actual march, I'm going to, tell everybody that I know, and you're welcome to, if you're coming as well, be sure to let people around you know that you're going to Squatters Pub at 7 o'clock. So once again, 147 West Broadway, and Broadway is 300 South, March 30th, 7 p.m., right after the Protect LDS Children March. You can go to Naked Mormonism Twitter and Facebook pages, and you're going to see pinned post and tweet about the hangout and all of the necessary information there. If you can check the attending box on that, we can possibly get a feel for the numbers of people that might be coming. Not sure what to expect, but if you want to come to that, or, you're welcome to go to John DeLynn's karaoke night as well. It's totally your choice. We're just offering as many opportunities as we possibly can, and I hope to see you there. It's going to be a lot of fun. And if you have any questions beyond that, you can always get a hold of me at those Twitter and Facebook pages or nakedmormonism@gmail.com, and I'll try and answer any questions you have related to the march or otherwise. And so all that said, I really hope to see you either at the march or at the hangout or at both of them. March beginning at Washington Square Park, noon, March 30th. It's going to be a busy day. It's an important day, though. That's the main takeaway. This is something that is crucial and important, and it is trying to put pressure on the church in order to bring them into the 21st century. What better way to do that than having a direct impact on the church right now? It's 1977 all over again. So with that, let's go ahead and shut it down for the evening. Thank you so much to Julie for running the Twitter and Facebook pages. She keeps the conversation going over there. Be sure to give her a follow at The Real Emma Hale. Thank you to Natalie Newell for being the production assistant on the back end and keeping the interviews and conversation rolling. Thank you so much to Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. You can find more of his music at aloststateofmind.com. Thank you to Andrew Torres of Opening Arguments Podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres for providing legal counsel for this show. Thank you so much to the patrons who support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, who gain access to a bunch of extra content and ad-free editions of every episode. And most importantly, thank you to the stupendously incredible listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. Hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.